আপনাদের সকলকে আমি আবারও আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আজকের ক্রিমিনাল লয়ের উপর এই আইন বিষয়ক অনুষ্ঠান ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল। আপনারা দেখছেন নিউক্যাসল ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ জাস্টিস লাম্বার্ট সে একজনকে যাবজ্জীবন কারাদণ্ড দিয়েছিল কারণ সে 7 ইয়ার ওল্ড একটা চাইল্ডকে হত্যা করেছিল, তাকে অনেকবার স্টেপ করেছিল, অনেক বিট আপ করেছিল, একটা ডেরিলিক বিল্ডিং এ তাকে নিয়ে আনইমাজিনেবল জাজ বলছে কি ফিয়ারের মধ্যে ছিল এই মেয়েটা, অনেক অকল্পনীয় একটা ভয়ের মধ্যে এই মেয়েটা ছিল। জাজ এই কথাগুলো বলছে এবং eventually snared by DNA advances in 2017 এই ঘটনাটা ঘটেছিল আপনার 1992 তে তাকে সাজা দিয়েছিল লাইফ ইমপ্রিজনমেন্ট এবং পরে ডিএনএ এর আবিষ্কার হয়েছে, ডিএনএ ম্যাচ করছে 2017 সালে। সে অনেক বছর ধরে কিভাবে ওরা সার্চ করতে সেই লোকটা মনে করতেছিল আমি তো এখন আউট অফ দ্য রিস্ক, কোনো সমস্যা নাই, আমি কিল করেছি এই চাইল্ডটাকে তাকে সেক্সুয়াল ফ্যান্টাসির জন্য, এখন আমি আমার রিস্ক ফ্রি, কোনো সমস্যা হবে না। কিন্তু ডিটেকটিভরা তাকে বের করেছে সেই 1992 সালের ঘটনার পরে 2017 সালে এবং সেটা ক্রাউন কোর্টে আপনার কেস হয়েছিল নিউক্যাসল ক্রাউন কোর্টে। এবং এই মেয়েটা সে তাকে চিনতো এবং তাকে ট্রাস্ট করেছিল এবং এই লোকটা তার এই ট্রাস্টের একটা অ্যাডভান্টেজ গ্রহণ করেছিল এবং তাকে ট্রিক করেছিল অক্টোবর আপনার 1992 তে তাকে ফলো করার জন্য ট্রিক করে তাকে একটা ডেরিলিক পরিত্যক্ত বিল্ডিং এর মধ্যে নিয়ে গিয়েছিল, সেখানে তাকে সে হত্যা করেছিল। এবং মেয়েটা খুব নাইভ ছিল, শিশুসুলভ সরলতা, সহজ মেয়ে, সে বুঝতে পারে নাই এই ডেঞ্জারাস ম্যান যে তাকে কিল করবে। এবং এখানে তাকে হত্যা করার পরে তার নেইবার ছিল সে এবং একটা তার নেইবারের বয়ফ্রেন্ড ছিল এই লোকটা এবং সে তাকে চিনত, চিনা জানার মধ্যে এটা হয়েছে। She was lured to a derelict building where she was murdered outside the abandoned building and her fate was sealed. When she screamed, Boyd decided to kill her to silence her. যখন সে স্ক্রিম করতেছিল এই লোকটা তাকে সাইলেন্স করার জন্য তাকে একদম কিল করেছিল। একটা পরিত্যক্ত বিল্ডিং এ নিয়ে গেছে এই হত্যাযজ্ঞটা ঘটানোর জন্য। এবং জাজ বলছে যে he struck Nikki in the face, struck Nikki মানে তাকে আঘাত করেছিল তার মুখের মধ্যে, to shut her up, তাকে মুখ বন্ধ করার জন্য, and pushed her into the pitch black building, একটা কালো একটা মানে পিচ বিল্ডিং এর মধ্যে তাকে নিয়ে গিয়েছিল, সেখানে পুশ করেছিল তাকে, where she must have been terrified, এবং সে ডেফিনেটলি সে খুবই টেরিফাইড হয়েছিল সেখানে। যা যে কথাগুলো বলছে, she must have quickly known she was trapped, মিসেস জাস্টিস লম্বার্ড said, এবং জাস্টিস লম্বার্ড সে বলছে কি এই মহিলা আমাদের জাস্টিসকে দেখছেন আপনারা, সে বলছে কি সে খুবই মনে করছিল কি সে একটা ট্র্যাপের মধ্যে আছে। এটা আপনারা শুনবেন আরো জাজের মুখেই, খুবই লোমহর্ষকর ঘটনা কিভাবে কি করেছে। And she was attacked and killed in another room, suggesting she had tried to flee her attacker এবং সে এক রুম থেকে অন্য রুমে তাকে তার মৃতদেহটা পাওয়া গেছে। এতে বোঝা যাচ্ছে, সাজেস্ট করছিল যে সে হয়তো পালানোর চেষ্টা করছিল এই ছোট 7 years old মেয়েটা। এই যে সেক্সুয়াল ফ্যান্টাসির জন্য, সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাটাকে, অ্যাবিউজের জন্য এই কাজটা সে করেছে। তখন তার বয়স ছিল 28 বছর, এই পুরুষটার বয়স। কিন্তু তাকে যখন সাজা দিয়েছিল তার বয়স অনেক বেশি, কারণ ঘটনা ঘটেছিল 1992 সালে, আর আপনার সেই সাজা হয়েছিল তার 2017 সালে। আমি কন্ট্রোল রুমকে রিকোয়েস্ট করছি আপনারা প্লিজ জাজের স্পিচটা আবার প্লে করেন।
Alan, you were convicted of an indecent assault upon a female under 14 years. 2 girls aged 9 and 12 were playing in a park. You approached the girls and took hold of the shoulder of one of them. You told her not to scream. You asked the other whether she had knickers on. You then took hold of the front of her clothing, placed your hand between her legs, touching her vagina over her clothing. In connection with this offence, you were interviewed by a probation officer when you admitted that when you had been approximately 22 years old or thereabouts, you had started to fantasise about both adults and children, in particular young girls. You told her that you would think about young girls being naked and what it would be like to touch their body and have sexual intercourse with them. It's against this background that I address the first issue which I must consider under Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020. And that concerns whether to impose a whole life order. Paragraph 2 of Schedule 21 provides for a starting point of a whole life term in cases of exceptionally high seriousness. Paragraph 2.2 provides that cases which would normally fall within this category of exceptionally high seriousness include at B, the murder of a child if it involves the abduction of the child or it involves sexual motivation. In this case, the Crown does not submit that Nikki was abducted by force. As I've said, she was seen by witnesses apparently skipping behind you in order to catch you up. But undoubtedly you tricked Nikki by lying to her about something or other. You took advantage of her young age and her naivety, and of the fact that she knew you and trusted you as a friend of the family. I agree with Mr. Wright that even though no physical abduction took place, your use of deception to lure Nikki to the old Exchange building approximates to the abduction scenario. The killing did not involve sexual motivation. I find no evidence that you were sexually thrilled by the killing. But the whole purpose of your tricking Nikki to go to the derelict building was, as I have found, in order to assault her sexually. The presence of these factors in conjunction with other factors which I've identified in my findings of fact have caused me to reflect very carefully upon whether this is one of those exceptional cases in which a whole life order should be imposed. Mr. Wright does not urge that course upon me, and on reflection, rightly so. Recent guidance from the Court of Appeal reminds judges that whole life orders should be imposed only where the facts of the case, considered as a whole, will leave the judge in no doubt that the offender must be kept in prison for the rest of his or her life. It's a sentence of last resort for cases of the most extreme gravity, and one reserved for a few exceptionally serious cases. Given this perspective, whilst undoubtedly a murder which will horrify all those who hear or read about it, I'm not able to come to the sure and confident conclusion that the imposition of a whole life term for the murder of Nikki Allen is appropriate. I am, however, wholly satisfied that the murder of Nikki Allen was one of particularly high seriousness, as envisaged by paragraph 3 of Schedule 21, and the correct starting point for the minimum term to be served is one of 30 years. Paragraph 3 of Schedule 21 sets out a list of features which, if present, would normally lead to the conclusion that the murder falls into the category of particularly high seriousness. It's a non-exhaustive list of examples only. The real question for me is whether, reflecting on the types of conduct referred to in those statutory examples, I am satisfied that there exist features of your murder of Nikki Allen which justify that description of Nikki's murder as one of particularly high seriousness. And I am entirely satisfied that those features do exist. I've already stated my conclusion that whilst you didn't physically abduct Nikki, what you did by tricking a trusting 7-year-old girl into going with you was very close to such a scenario. That factor, it seems to me, is one that I can and must take into account when considering the seriousness of the murder. I also take into account that your purpose in luring Nikki away from the Garths was to sexually assault her, and that this is what you did, or at least tried to do, when in the scrubland around the building. One of the examples of factors which would normally justify the inclusion of the murder within the classification of particular seriousness is that the murder involved sexual conduct. That, I find, was not present in this case. I can't be sure that you deliberately lifted Nikki's t-shirt up so as to expose her chest, and or that there was sexual conduct involved in the killing itself. However, the facts of Nikki's murder come very close indeed to involving sexual conduct, and that your purpose in luring her away was sexual, and I have found that you did sexually assault her, or at least attempt to do so outside the building. Again, this, it seems to me, is a factor which I can and must take into account when considering the starting point for the minimum term which you should serve. Finally, I take into account your purpose in killing Nikki, to prevent her telling anyone what you'd done. This does not come within the description of a murder to obstruct or interfere with the course of justice, as stated in paragraph 3.2. No course of justice had been set in motion by the time you killed Nikki. But nonetheless, it appears to me that the purpose of your killing Nikki is a factor which I can take into account, albeit to a very modest degree, when considering the starting point for the minimum term. The presence, therefore, of these three features drive me to the inescapable conclusion that your murder of Nikki Allen must be categorised as one of particular seriousness. Each of the features which I have identified approximate to various statutory examples in paragraph 3.2. Mr. Pitter urges me not to reach this conclusion on the basis that I can't be sure that the murder bears any of the features which are mentioned in paragraph 3.2. But he poses the wrong question of the court. The question is not whether the facts of any murder can be shoehorned into one of the examples in paragraph 3.2, but whether, taking the range of examples into account, the court can be sure that the murder is one properly described as of particular seriousness. From that starting point of 30 years, I then consider the aggravating factors, and there are many. Mr. Pitter urges me to avoid the double counting of these aggravating factors, and I agree with the need for caution in this regard. I accept, just by way of example, that the use of two weapons overlaps with the vicious nature of your attack upon Nikki. However, viewed cumulatively and guarding against double counting, the aggravating factors justify a very significant increase from the starting point of 30 years. The aggravating factors are as follows. The mental and physical suffering which Nikki Allen experienced before you kill her. This bears repetition. I take into account here that period of mental suffering which she must have experienced after you had pushed her into the derelict building. She must have quickly known that she was trapped. She must have quickly known that you were coming after her to hurt her. It was cold and dark. I can't be sure of the time which you took to stalk her in that building. It may have been a short time only, but however long it was, it must have been a truly terrifying experience for this 7-year-old girl. I also take into account here what happened outside the building before you pushed her inside it. There was clearly some sort of struggle, after your assault or attempted assault, and one which Nikki was bound to lose. And I don't underestimate how frightening this experience must have been for her. A further aggravating factor is your use of two weapons, a brick and a knife, which you took to the scene. In addressing me on the application of Schedule 21, Mr. Pitter urges me to find that not only is paragraph 3 not engaged, but nor is paragraph 4. Mr. Pitter argues that the knife which you carried was not one which was taken to the scene in the technical sense intended to be conveyed by paragraph 4. I reject this submission. I am sure that you took a knife with you to the building and that you intended when you were there to commit an offence of sexual assault and or have that knife available as a weapon. It's not disputed that you used the weapon in committing the murder of Nikki Allen. Paragraph 4 is therefore engaged. This finding is, however, overtaken by my earlier conclusion that this is a murder of particular seriousness. However, the fact that a knife was taken, even a penknife, and it was used, represents a significant aggravating factor which I must take into account. A further aggravating factor is the vicious and brutal nature of your attack upon Nikki, involving 2 blows at least to the head and over 30 stabs to her body. A further aggravating factor is your attempt to conceal the body by placing her in a distant room in the basement. And finally, your statement to the police. Whilst this was made after George Heron had been charged with Nikki's murder, nonetheless, you are providing a statement in which you gave yourself a false alibi, whilst another person was tried for the murder which you had committed. I must, of course, consider such mitigation as may exist. There is none. Your counsel urges me to take into account your IQ, which falls within the extremely low range, placing you in the bottom 2% of the general population. I accept the contents of the report prepared on your behalf by Dr. Harry Wood, a psychologist who describes your mild learning difficulties and a degree of intellectual impairment. However, I am unable to accept that the content of that report in any respect is relevant to the minimum term which I must impose. Any intellectual difficulties which you face do not affect your culpability for this offence. You demonstrated quite sufficient guile to lure Nikki away from the Garths, and you were quick to attempt to cover your tracks by inventing a false alibi which you gave to the police. Nor do I accept that your age, then or now, is a relevant factor mitigating in your favour. At the time of this murder, you were an adult of 25. You were not a child or an adolescent who knew no better. You're now aged 55 years. The fact that as a result of the minimum term which I may impose, you may die in prison is not, it seems to me, a factor which I should take into account. Therefore, taking all of these factors into account, the minimum term which I would have ordered under Schedule 21 is one of not less than 37 years. I move on to stage 2 of my assessment, which is the Home Secretary's determination. I must now determine what the decision of the Home Secretary would have been before 2002 by applying the applicable guidance at the time. On the 10th of February of 1997, a letter was sent by Lord Bingham to all judges who made recommendations as to the appropriate term in murder cases. That letter advocated 14 years as the normal penalty for the average or normal or unexceptional murder before taking aggravating and mitigating factors into account. The letter went on to list the various factors which would likely call for a sentence mitigating the normal penalty. Those factors included subnormality or mental abnormality, and spontaneity or lack of premeditation beyond that necessary to constitute the offence. For example, a sudden response to family pressure or to prolonged stress. Lord Bingham listed the following factors as likely to call for a sentence more severe than the norm. They included the killing of a child or a very old or otherwise vulnerable victim, evidence of sadism, gratuitous violence or sexual maltreatment, humiliation or degradation before the killing, and the use of firearms or other dangerous weapons, whether carried for defensive or offensive reasons. Lord Bingham remarked that, whilst a recommendation of a punitive
দর্শক, আপনারা শুনছেন জাজের স্পিচ। খুব সুন্দর করে সবগুলো একের পর এক উনি বুঝিয়ে যাচ্ছিলেন কেন তাকে যাবজ্জীবন কারাদণ্ড দিয়েছিল, তাকে কেন মিনিমাম 29 ইয়ার্স থাকতে হবে এটা বলছে, এবং সে বলছে কি আমি একটা ইনএসকেপেবল কনক্লুশনে পৌঁছেছি, তার মানে আমি একদম পুরো কনভিন্সড হয়েছি, এবং আমার কোনো এই কনক্লুশন আসার জন্য আমার কোনো পালানোর কোনো পথ ছিল না। এইখানে এটাই হইল একদম রাইট কনক্লুশন, ইনএসকেপেবল কনক্লুশনে আমি পৌঁছেছি। জাস্টিস লম্বার্ড, নিউক্যাসল ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাস্টিস, আমরা দেখছেন সেই কথা বলছে, এবং সে বলছে কি যে her fear as she saw you lurching towards her in the dark is unimaginable. তুমি যখন তার দিকে মুভ করতেছিলা অন্ধকারের মধ্যে, তার ভয়টা যে কি ছিল সেটা একটা অকল্পনীয়, এটা আপনার জাস্টিস বলছে। It must have been a truly terrifying experience for this 7-year-old girl. এটা নিশ্চয়ই একটা খুবই টেরিফাইং অভিজ্ঞতা এই 7 বছর বয়স্ক এই মেয়েটার জন্য। সে কিন্তু আবার পার্কের মধ্যে অন্যান্য মেয়েদেরকে এগুলো, শিশু মেয়েদেরকে এগুলো করেছে। Nikki would have endured unimaginable fear as Boyd pursued her inside the old exchange building. তাকে যখন ওই যে পুরানা ড্যারিলিক পরিত্যক্ত এক্সচেঞ্জ বিল্ডিং এর মধ্যে নেওয়া হয়েছিল, তখন সে ডেফিনেটলি খুবই ভয়ের মধ্যে ছিল, এই কথা জাজ বলছে। তারপরে সে বলছে কি অনেক কথাগুলো বলছে, আপনারা শুনছেন, এবং তার ফ্র্যাকচার করে দিয়েছিল তার মাথাটাকে, এবং রিপিটেডলি স্ট্যাবড হার in her chest and dragging down her to the stairs, আপনার স্টেয়ারের নিচে তাকে নিয়ে গেছে এবং তাকে ডাম্প করেছিল বেসমেন্টের মধ্যে তাকে ড্যাম্প করেছিল। এগুলো সব ঘটনা করার পরে সে এই মেয়েটা, এই 7 বছর বয়স্ক এই মেয়েটাকে সে হত্যা করেছিল, সেটা আপনারা শুনছেন জাজের মুখেই। জাস্টিস লম্বার্ড, নিউক্যাসল ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ। আরো বাকি আছে, নেক্সট সেগমেন্টে শুনবেন আপনারা। আমি শর্ট একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি, ব্রেকের পরে আমি আবার ফিরে আসব। আমি সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল। আপনারা সবাই আমার সাথেই থাকুন, আপনারা এই ভিডিওটা